This season of the Good Up podcast is sponsored by Empath Psychological Services. Good Up is our space to talk about those experiences in life we didn't know we all had in common. We're the after work happy hour conversation with your best friend.
You good up vibe, like, hello.
The place where you bring up the hard parts of life, the ones that made you laugh, and the things that made you who you are. Because who said becoming good up wasn't a little bit uncomfortable? Stay tuned for more information about this week's episode.
Here at the Good Up Pod, we're all about shedding light on life experiences that have contributed to who we are and learning to navigate them to find a feeling that's, well, good up.
For some of us, that journey includes therapy. Empath Psychological Services operates with the belief that life's challenges are not all of who we are.
They aim to create a non-judgmental environment to help their clients harness their own power and to find their path to mental well-being. Good Up and Empath Psychological Services share a passion for helping others navigate their own healing their way.
If you're interested in teletherapy services in the U.S. Virgin Islands or the state of Texas, check out the link in the description box for more information on how you can book a session with Empath Psychological Services. Hey, beautiful people, this is your captain speaking. Please put your fucking seatbelts on and don't piss me off. Thanks.
What? This is Devi Vishwakumar's sorry at her grandmother's wedding. Spoiler alert.
Bitch. I said you. Ooh, I was not expecting that one. I want to me off.
I'm so obsessed with Never Have I Ever. Like, I already binged the whole 4th season. I'm so sad that that's the last season of the show. I've loved it since it came out.
You could tell the girls, like, what is the idea that you have for the pod?
Okay, so let me just come on out with it. Hey, Isa and I added a really fun segment to the show. We don't have a name for it. Maybe in the meantime, it's going to be Devi Vishwakumar's sorry until I come up with an actual name. But every episode, I am going to pull an astrology chart and I am going to give you guys an aspect, like a notable aspect of the week. So I'll let you guys know where the planets are. I'll make it very digestible. So I'll make sure it's something that makes sense to you guys, something that you can understand. And for those of you who follow me, I tend to post things like this on my page already, but I'm going to provide it on the podcast where I'm pretty much giving you guys a mini forecast based on a specific planet, a specific aspect, like a notable transit. Like, for instance, right now, Venus is in Leo. So we might be talking about that because she's going to be there for a while and she's going retrograde soon. So stay tuned for that, and you can look forward to it every week on the podcast.
And please expect me to ask very basic questions to Deidre for those. I know a little more about astrology now, but there are people listening to the podcast who, like, we hear Mercury going into retrograde all the time and we don't understand what I mean or what a fuck her problem is. Yeah. So I am
Mercury
going to be
asking, he, by the way.
Of course it's a man. Of course it's a man. Anyway, well, I will be on your behalf asking Deidre those types of questions when we do these segments. But I love that Deidre loves what she does, and I love to see her do that work. And I think this is the space for it. And everybody could use that little guidance somewhere, whether or not you're big into astrology or not. That's your fucking business, and this is our fucking podcast. You see how that'll work?
Say it. If you don't fuck with astrology, you don't have to listen. You can skip.
Yeah.
You could listen to something else.
Go to the 5-minute mark. I don't fucking know.
The what? Oh, the 5-minute mark. Oh, I thought you said 5-minute mark. Like, I'm like, there's a store called 5-minute mark.
I wish.
And that you come in and everything you need is right there in the front.
Exactly. I only have to spend 5 minutes in this bitch, and then you get me the fuck out.
Yeah,
I love that. You know what? That's a business idea. Whoever get rich after the fuck, sponsor we.
But I feel like if we just went to the store with a list, we would spend 5 minutes in there.
I do go to the store with a list, and somehow I'd still end up in a bitch for so long because, again,
ADHD.
ADHD. So today's episode topic is, I think, going to be very interesting. I've been excited about doing this topic for a while. Ironically, I feel like I'm wearing the exact same shirt that I was wearing the day I was like, we need to do this topic. Anyway, so we're going to be talking about code switching and how it affects our lives, specifically the lives of Black people and or people of color, because I think we know code switching very intimately.
Yes, ma'am.
So before we start, I'm gonna read out some fucking definitions so you know that I know what I'm talking about. And if I don't know what I'm talking about, bitch, Google did. So here we go. So code switching has multiple definitions. The first is using the use of one dialect, register, accent, or language variety over another, depending on social or cultural context, to project a specific identity. And to simplify that, the other definition is the modifying of one's behavior, appearance, etc., to adapt to different socio-cultural norms. And just adding context here, Black people and other people of color are going to identify heavily with that latter definition, because it's code switching is the language, mannerisms, and body language we use when we are in the company of peers from a different class and or race. And if I want to dumb that down just a little bit more, the way you don't act around white people is probably not how you act around your fucking friends, okay? I don't know how else to simplify that. When we are around them people, we don't act the same.
Yeah. You know what's funny?
I
remember when I was younger, I kind of went through a phase where, because there was a period of my life where I was spending more time around white people. And I felt this, not that I felt this need, but I caught myself acting more Black than I typically do. And I think it was like a defense mechanism, because I don't like when white people assume that I'm a good Black. And you know what? Do you know?
So you were like, I gotta rep my set real quick.
I need to make it clear that I'm Black. How did Megan say it in that song? Black, bliggity, big Black, whatever. Bitch, I'm Black. Okay. I like being Black. I identify
skin,
as
light
Black.
Skin, beige,
yes,
fluorescent beige, bitch.
I'm Black. Okay. So
I
I caught myself kind of talking, because y'all know I don't really you know, if anything, you're gonna catch me with my Crucian dialect, but my standardized English is not very, you know, Ebonics. I sound like a caricature when I, you know, use AAVE a lot of the time, and I'm okay with that. But when I'm around, or at least back in the day, a few years ago, I used to catch myself being more like obviously Black. I hate to say it like
kind
that.
of like a defense mechanism.
Yeah, and it's funny because growing up in school, I used to get made fun of for talking white. But when I would be with people, I would like act more Black. I would put it on more, and I wouldn't let them do it. But I used to kind of do it as a way for them to know, like, I am not the Black person who's around y'all because I want to be around
like
y'all.
don't,
and
I'm not your like, token Black. Don't fuck around.
Yes, it was very much that I'm not the token Black. Okay.
I can relate to that. In a sense, especially living here now. So I live in Tucson, Arizona, which is about as white as you imagine it to be.
My God.
I am one of maybe 3 people of color at work, but the only person who identifies as Black.
Yeah.
And if you look at me, you're like, that says a lot, bitch. So at work, I don't know that I do it in a very like obvious way, but I always try to make it very clear of like what my stance is on like Black issues. I try to be very vocal about that because I want it to be clear, like, please do not don't ever get comfortable around me to say some crazy shit because I am not the fucking one. Like, I don't know. It's like like you said, a defense mechanism. But I mean, I do both though. I will say I kind of go back and forth. So my notes from Alia, they talk about, you know, how people like change the effect of their voice, their posture, or refrain from using colloquialisms when speaking to someone they wouldn't otherwise connect with outside of work. I find myself doing that, and Steven even commented in one day. He was like, he's like, you code switch with me anyway, right? Like, I don't really talk to Steven in my dialect all of the time, and we'll talk about that later. So he's like, you code switch with me, but you code switch with me sort of as a Black person. And then when you talk to your people from work, you speak like very proper English, but there's no hint of like any kind of like Black, I guess, like language in that. He's like, you just speak proper English with them. And he's like, sometimes you sound like a white woman when you're talking to them, right? And he's like, I don't know that you know you're doing it. And he wasn't saying it as like, oh, it's a problem. He's like, I have never heard you speak that way, because he'd never heard, like, he's not at work with me.
Right.
So he's like, there's a version of you that works where you work, there's a version of you that's here, and then there's a completely version of you when you go home or when you are around your family or your friends from back home. I was like, God damn, that's a lot.
And it gets exhausting.
It gets exhausting.
Very
but
exhausting.
A good example of it would be like white people have a specific kind of humor or like way of, I guess, like bantering with each other that is very different from how Black people attack to each other. Like their forms of entertainment, their taste in things, everything is different. And some of the things, like me and you could sit down and chat shit about Beyonce for hours, right?
Hours, yes.
Even somebody who don't like Beyonce, if they're a Black person, will respond and be like, well, personally, I fuck with Rihanna more. Like, that's my bitch.
Yeah, they'll be able to be a part of that discussion.
Yeah, we can talk about a lot of what we talk about with other Black people is Black culture, right? Is the things we experience. Or sometimes we sit in a room and we like, let me tell you what this fucking white woman do today. And the shit she said. Like,
say it.
We're very different. But when we in a room with white people, like if a white person does some white person shit and another white person is in the room, I can't turn to them and be like, this some white people shit. Like I can't say that to a white person.
I know what you mean.
Too could be guilty of white people shit. So it's just
for one,
different.
the white person that you would turn to wouldn't even understand why you're turning to them.
Exactly.
It might be something that's just normal to them. You
Black
know,
people we don't even have to say anything. The last time I had a Black coworker, so I the same place I've worked now, there were Black people who worked there before. They're just not there anymore, right? I had one Black coworker who used to sit behind me. And people would say or do shit, and all I had to do was fucking swing my chair around and just look at this girl like.
No, but honestly, I had the same thing. Me and a former coworker when I used to work at my ghetto ass corporate job. Up until she joined, I was the only Black person on my team, and I mean, you know, there's a lot of controversy surrounding whether or not Dominicans consider themselves Black. We'll leave it at that.
I know Black. I'm Dominican. I know Black. Every time I see that clip, I don't die.
I don't know that I've ever heard her refer to herself as Black. But she is aware that somewhere in her ancestry there's somebody African at the very least. She's aware. She knows that there's no way that she can only have like European
Spaniard
descent.
Yeah.
So we'll leave it at that. In any case, she is a woman of color and she got some Dominican parents, you know, like so we would have those little moments. Like, so the way our work setting was set up, I was on one end and she was on the other end, but we faced each other, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we kind of were like on the diagonal ends of each other. It was really cool. So somebody would do or say something that was white as hell, and she and I would literally just look up at each other.
Listen,
we would literally
look.
No, the look is everything, and it just makes
that look has sustained me so many times.
Like, it makes being in those spaces so much more tolerable. Like and depending on the nature of the person's whiteness, we would either just kind of look up with our eyes, or we would literally just stop, look straight up, and then look at each other. It would literally, and it never failed. It was like
it's a whole conversation happening in that look.
Yeah, just in that look.
It's like, did this bitch really just said what the fuck she just
literally
said?
We would be typing or whatever, and then we would just stop, look straight up, and then look toward each other, and then like kind of stare in each other's eyes for like 3 seconds, and then just go back to it. Would be, you know how you said you and the one Black person would like turn y'all chair and look at it. It became that, like me and I'm gonna just say her name, me and Jennifer would literally like stop and just look at each other.
Yeah, like we would be in I'll never forget, we would be in these large meetings with like external stakeholders or whatever, and they would say some shit and we could be across the fucking conference room for each other. And the minute I look up, eyes just already on me, and I would have to try everything not to fucking laugh, because again, there's a whole conversation happening in that look between Black people when we are around some white people and they do some white people shit.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Either way, like she would do it too, right? She's this very, you know, fully Black, very visibly Black woman, and she experienced just so much shit in my job, right? But I noticed that like before I really got to know her, there was a version of her that I thought was like her full version of herself, right, at work, right? Like the way she would talk, the way she would engage in conversation. But then the minute we got to be in a space together where it was just us, her complete, like the way she says her words change, like the Black woman just jump out as she like, and it was such a different experience.
Yeah.
And it's I think my obviously I don't enjoy code switching at work, but my favorite part of code switching at work is when you get into that space with another Black person and it's almost like taking off the fucking mask of like, all right, so now that these white
Yes.
people in a room, what the fuck? Like, you to just
What
be
was that?
like,
Like,
what the fuck was
bitch,
that?
like, girl. Yeah, it's
It's
very much
very,
that.
yeah, it's
Do
very
you find
interesting.
because I recently kind of came to realize that I'm getting I'm not as good at code switching as I used to be.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like when I was younger, I was really good at code switching.
Mm-hmm.
But the older I get, the less well, for two things. The older I get, the less interested I am in code switching. But also, the older I get, the less bandwidth I have to code switch.
Yeah.
And
So
so
I was gonna ask you that is there anywhere now where you still find yourself code switching in any way, whether it's major or minor?
So I find that my version of code switching is very minor. I only code switch so that I can be understood. Because if I speak in my full Crucian dialect to somebody who has never even left the state they grew up in, they're not going to understand me. So I speak standard American English, and you see, like, you could hear my accent, but you also can understand the words that are coming out of my mouth. That's the furthest I go with code switching at this point.
Yeah.
Because for me, I just want to be understood when I speak, and I'm not interested in you because, you know, xenophobia is a thing. So the minute people detect an accent, sometimes they kind of talk down and they kind of assume you're dumb or whatever the case
or they
may
think
be.
everything's funny and they want you to repeat yourself. And
yeah, or shit. they feel the need to slow things down so that you can understand them. And so luckily I don't have that experience with people. They just, like, at least where I am, and I think maybe part of it is because it's pretty common for people from the Caribbean to migrate to like the New York, New Jersey area. So maybe people are just used to talking to Caribbean people, you know what I mean? But yeah, I just kind of do like a basic version of code switching. I just speak clear English and I don't care whether or not I have a strong accent. Whereas when I was younger, people used to say I sounded white. You know, if I spoke on the phone, not even on the phone, but like one of the things that would happen a lot is when people found out that I was from the Caribbean, they would be shocked. They would be like, you don't even have an accent. Like, what? That's crazy. And after a while, I kind of didn't like that because I'm like, I'm from the Caribbean though. Like, I'm okay with being from I don't want to sound like I'm not from the Caribbean. You know what I mean?
It's definitely a like a battle, and it's definitely like you go into these like identity conflicts of like, okay, well, how should I sound and how should I speak?
Yeah,
and what should I do?
Because there's also like that struggle of when I end up in spaces that are not diverse enough, where I'm the only Black person, I don't want to seem like one of those token Black people who want because there's token Black people who are token and they just can't help it, and then there's those who like being the token Black person. There's those who like being in those spaces and they kind of feel better about themselves and they feel like they're a little bit more accomplished because they're in proximity to whiteness, and that's a whole other conversation. But I never want to be mistaken for somebody like that. So
do you ever feel like guilty when, or has this ever been your experience that like you tell somebody you from the Virgin Islands and they say, oh, well, you don't have an accent, and you kind of feel like, fuck, like, am I not representing my people right now? Like,
when
it'll
I was
happen
young,
to me all the time where
when I
I'll be
was
like,
young, when I was younger and my code switching was better and I was more intentional about my code switching, I used to feel weird because I used to be like, well, it's not that I don't want to have an accent. I just want you to understand me. Whereas now that's why I'm very like, I'm just going to talk the way I would talk at home, but just make sure that certain words that I would chop the fuck up don't get chopped up. Because like, now what happens is people do hear my accent. Some people still don't. Some people are still in shock when I say that I'm from the Caribbean, but other people can hear my accent because they're more worldly, and you know what I mean? So they'll be like, where are you from? Like, you don't sound like you're from here. And then I'll be like, oh, I'm from the Virgin Islands, you know? So yeah, I did used
people
to feel...
will just like express full shock whenever they find out that I'm from the Virgin Islands. And I battle with that a lot because I'm like, I feel like I should bring where I'm from with me, but at the same time, like, it's like you said, it's a form of self-protection.
Yeah.
And it's also a form of like, this fuck ain't for you. Like, I feel like dialect is a part of how I express my love within my culture and how I connect with people who are of my culture. And I almost feel like talking to you in my dialect, it's less about you not understanding, because I think to an extent you could probably figure that shit out. But to the other side of it is, how do I word this? I don't want to give you what's
kind of
not
want
for
to
you.
gatekeep.
I want to gatekeep.
I see what you're saying.
You don't need to know what Marascont is. It's not for you. Like,
and that's the thing, and that's what I mean. So for me, I'm not gonna be using words like Marascont, you know. But I'm gonna. That's what I'm gonna say. I'm very clear with using standard American words, but because I feel like the accent and some of the words that are exclusive to us, they don't go hand in hand. You know, like I feel like I can just speak to you clearly with standard English, but with an accent. You know what I mean? And I don't have to say some of the words that are exclusive to us or that only we would understand. And one of the things, part of it is because I live someplace where a lot of Caribbean people tend to be. I'm very intentional about using my accent when I'm out so that I could connect with other Caribbean people.
Yeah.
Because
and keep in mind that an accent and a dialect are two different things.
Exactly.
Like an accent influences the way you speak a language, but a dialect is almost like an entirely different language altogether.
Exactly. And so I'm not using my dialect in these places. I'm just I'm just speaking with my accent. Whereas before, both things got left home, you know? And so it gives me an opportunity to connect with other Caribbean people because first of all, we got Frenchies. So and Frenchies look white. We have Black Caribbean people who look like you, who look way more racially ambiguous, you know? So even if I'm in a space where I don't see anybody who's definitively Black like me, there might be somebody who does recognize my accent.
And we're always, Caribbean people are always listening for accent. That's one thing about me. And it don't matter what version of a Caribbean accent I hear. If I hear a Caribbean accent, I'm going to be like, where you from?
Where you from?
Need to
exactly.
know. You sound like my people.
Exactly. I met an Uber driver. He's not even from St. Croix, but he has friends in St. Croix. And because of my accent, he's like, where are you from? And I told him, and he's like, oh my God, he's Puerto Rican. And he was like, oh my God, I love St. Croix. I have friends there. I visit all the time. And I met him maybe like a week before I was visiting home one time, a couple years ago. And it was so exciting. The accent comes with me because I love connecting with other Caribbean people.
Yeah. My code switching journey is one for the fucking books. Okay. It's I don't know. I'm starting to realize now that the reason why I have gone through so many different phases of code switching is because I have never fully accepted like who I am and all of that stuff until now. Like I'm at this age where I'm like, okay, I know who I am. I don't give a fuck, whatever. But when I was younger, I went through a lot of like not being really okay with like who I was as a person and trying to find different versions of that and like being comfortable with different versions of myself. So my code switching really started when I went to college for the first time in Virginia. And it literally took one incident for me to decide never to talk in my dialect or my accent to stateside people ever again. Like it literally.
What happened?
So I went to college at Norfolk State. Shout out to you. For my freshman year. And it was my first time living anywhere outside of the Virgin Islands, right? And I remember the minute my mother left, because she came with me and then, you know, we got ready, got my dorm ready, and then she left. And it was band camp. And college band camp, I know people love like the band camp jokes, but college band camp is turned up, psychologically and physically like a mind fuck. Okay. You are sleep deprived. You're being treated like shit for just the fact that you are a freshman. And as a freshman, anything you say or do can be used against you for the entertainment of everybody else in the fucking room, right?
Oh, I already know where this is going. I'm getting mad already. I'm gonna fuck y'all up.
So the minute I started talking, like my first initial days of meeting people, it would like, we could not have regular conversations without the entire conversation becoming about my fucking accent. And it was like, in my mind, I'm like, I already going through enough. I want to be invisible, right? I don't want to be the center of attention because again, as a freshman, when there's all this stuff going on, you don't want to be the person who everybody calling out, right?
Yeah.
So I was like, you know what? I'm just going to flip the switch, right? And I decided like, I'm not going to use my accent, whatever. And it was so funny because I did it within the first couple of days and there were other Virgin Islands people who were joining the band at the same time as me. And it had other Virgin Islands people in the band already. So when I would talk to them, I would talk in my accent. Or when I would talk to the other Caribbean people, I would talk in my accent. But then somebody else will walk up and I would switch. And I remember, I know Jakeem listening to this because he was in band with me. So I remember him being like, why the fuck you don't talk to these? He was so mad that I was code switching for them. But I straight up tell him, I was like, every time y'all talk, they mimic you. They don't turn on the Jamaican accent, the generic Caribbean accent to try to mimic you. They don't ask you to repeat yourself. I'm like, I'm not going through that shit every fucking day all the time.
Yeah.
And it will be people who you think you cool with, your friends, all of that stuff, and you in the middle of a conversation, and they're like, "Yeah, man," and you just like,
"Oh my God, fuck you, literally, fuck you."
I think for some people, it's like, well, why didn't you just correct them? Why didn't you just tell them to stop? And it's like, how many people every day do you expect to have this conversation with? Them, it was just jokes, but sometimes, I mean, inappropriate shit could be a joke too. Like, it was very much xenophobic. It was just a lot of shit that was happening. And again, at the time, like, I was having a very difficult mental transition into not living in the Virgin Islands anymore. This was my first time, like, oh, I don't live there. Like, I live in this new place. I don't know any fucking body. I don't have any friends here. So I just made the decision, you know, from that day not to do it. And it's followed me since then. So even when I left Virginia and I went to Texas, I made that sort of unconscious decision to not introduce myself using my accent or my dialect.
Yeah.
And you know, Texas, like, I got to know people. I ended up in relationships, like, met my husband, obviously. Like, I started developing these, like, lifelong friendships, never having let them hear how I don't really talk.
That's crazy.
Except for, like, when my mother would call me or somebody would call me and I would instantly, you know, turn it on. I remember one time being in the office in Texas, new situation, obviously. And answering the phone, I think it was my sister, my mother, talking to her and then turning around and my band director looking at me and being like, "You like a fucking CIA agent. Like, it was a completely different person in front of me just now." And I started to laugh. I instantly went back to talking to him the way that I normally talk to him. And he was just so fascinated with the fact that, like, we can do that so easily.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's been that whole journey. And then it became it's gone from code switching my accent to being a pageant girl and code switching, like, the pageant version, the very print proper versus like how I don't really fucking act. It's been when you go to walk and you talk to white people versus when you talk to Black people. Like, there's so many layers in my life of different forms of code switching, down to even, I think, my sexuality and, like, my identity. To an extent, I code switch within my own family, because who I am in my full, like, sexuality and the shit that I talk about and the shit that I say with, let's say, my sister who knows that I'm out versus my parents, two completely different people, right? So it didn't really come to a head, the whole long story just to say, it didn't come to a head until I went to a conference, which is what we were talking about before we started recording. I went to a conference last month in Baltimore, and we went to a Black Caucus meeting, which is essentially, hey, all of the Black people in this conference of 1,000 people or more, we going in this room to talk. What these white people? So dopest experience I've had since I started working in this field. And we get in this room. There's at least 200 Black people in here. There's a panel.
Oh my God.
It would listen. And then in one point, they asked all the Black men them to stand up, and every last one of them were fine. I was like, yes. So excited. They were so beautiful. I was like, I need to leave Arizona. Anyway, you don't forget how just, like, fucking good Black people look until you don't have them around. Anyway,
you know what? I get that. I get that. I keep forgetting that you don't get to see Black people.
I don't get to see Black people every day.
I can see that.
There have been times I've gone days and weeks without seeing a Black person. Okay. So that's also part of this experience. So we in this room, in this Black Caucus meeting, they're having a panel, and this Jamaican woman is one of the speakers, and she starts talking about code switching. And she says, code switching, so many of us have convinced ourselves that code switching is our form of self-protection, but many of us have not acknowledged that code switching is also self-harm. And the minute she said that, my dumbass in the back of the room just tearing up, because I've been going through hell on a personal note at my job. So I just started getting emotional, because I'm like, fuck. Like, so, you know, obviously more things happen in our room and in our conversation. But ever since then, which inspired this episode, I've been thinking about, like, how have I harmed myself in the last 10 plus years of because this is a decade now since I started college, by code switching. So she was talking about how, like, if you think about it, if you are code switching at work, You are at work 40 hours a week. You're at work more than you are anywhere else. So whatever version you bring in with yourself to work is the version that is you the majority of the time, right? And then you only get to be that true, relaxed, full version of yourself when you come home and in your free time. And eventually, the more you do that code switching at work, you start to notice that it's harder and harder to go back to the regular version of yourself when you go home and when you're around people. So the minute she said that, the reason I got emotional is like, well, when I come home, I don't talk in my accent.
Damn, yeah. And it's funny because I made a mental note of that when you said that you code switch with Steven. I found myself being like, when do you get to be your fucking self? That's fucking bananas to me.
Which is why I was like, I about to have a fucking mental crisis in this conference in Baltimore because I didn't even think about it, right? So when I came home,
I want to hug you right now.
When I came home, right? Mind you, and let me be clear, I never really acknowledged why I was code switching with Steven because he fully understands the Virgin Islands accent. Like he's around my family all the time. There's nothing about our dynamic that requires me to code switch with him.
Right.
Except for the fact that like I've done it for so long. I did it when we started dating. So it almost feels like, okay, well, you almost a decade into this relationship, you're going to start talking to this.
You know what's so funny? And that's a big part of why I bring my accent with me, but not my dialect. But once I start getting closer to a man, the dialect comes with me because I have to be myself. Like I cannot you know what I mean? And so even like, and it becomes fun because then it's like, oh my God, like then it becomes this thing of them trying to understand me. Like the last guy I was involved with, he was born and raised here in Jersey, but I believe his parents are Haitian. So it wasn't hard for him to understand me, but there were things he still couldn't understand. So it was a good way for us to kind of like, for him to kind of be like, slow down and tell me that again, mama. Like, and then I would tell it to him and he would be like, okay. And then I don't remember. One thing I taught him, which was kind of fun, was in your ass.
In your ass. Like, and that's the thing, like I'd be teaching Steven something was like, every now and then it'll be so funny because some days I'd just wake up and be like, I don't choose violence. I'd be like, fuck this American ass accent. I'd walk up and be like, hey, and I'll just start talking to him. He'd be like, oh, so you from St. Croix? Okay, cool.
You from St. Croix today? That's cute.
That's fine. And for him, it's like no adjustment whatsoever. Yeah. But when I came home from this conference, like me and he had a long conversation about it, and I was like, Steven, like, I feel like I'm going through a fucking identity crisis. Like, why? Like, same question you asked. If I'm not myself at work, if I'm not speaking the way that I normally speak at home, and if all of my friends are not in Arizona, like, when the fuck can I be myself, right? You know what was my answer? When I recorded the podcast.
And Good Up is
the one, it's not right, but Good Up is the one space where I have always been able to be exactly who the fuck I am to the point where it's very unhinged. This shit I don't say on this podcast, it's because I can't say it nowhere else.
Hey, Isa. First of all,
I don't think people realize
I was binge watching like a lot of our like clips, and I'm like, what the fuck is wrong with us?
Yeah,
like
we'd just
be saying some wild shit. I'm like, we must be stopped. We are unhinged.
A lot to say. So I've been in this like deep thought about code switching and about what that means for me and about what harm it's causing me as a person. Yeah. And what I don't know how to really phrase this, but when you look back at a decade of your life and realize that you've been committing self-harm for a decade, it's kind of insane. Like, you don't feel like, fuck, why did I do that? But at the end of the day, I have accepted shit to happen. I had my reasons for doing it. I had my reasons for choosing to protect myself in that way. And I've been talking to my friends about it, like my really close friends, day-to-day friends, and saying like, hey, I think I might just like not code switch with you specifically because that shit kind of exhausting and I need more spaces to like be my full self. But I'm not doing that shit with everybody. Like, so if you see me talking one way on like social media or whatever, and then you see me talking one way, like, just bear with me as I try to figure this shit out. Or like Steven, like I'm like, Steven, we ain't doing this shit no more. If your parents be like, what the fuck she talking about? Well, they're gonna have to figure that shit out. Especially if I give birth to their grandchildren, they're gonna figure that shit out.
Hello. And that's the other, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's so for some reason, not for some reason, I know the reason. When Dylan's dad and I had him, we would always speak to him in a standard American English accent. One, because even though Dylan's dad was raised in the Virgin Islands, he left at a young age. Like he left when he was like 17, and he spent, and obviously I've already told you guys, he's a lot older than me. So he spent his entire life, he essentially lost his accent, basically. He lost his accent. And he didn't move back to St. Croix till he was in his late 40s. So at that point, he'd already lost his accent. Because code switching came naturally to me, usually we just spoke with a standard American English accent in the house. Sometimes I would speak my Crucian and he fully understood me. You know what I mean? But by the time we had Dylan mostly heard our American accents. You know what I mean? So Dylan doesn't have an accent, which kind of breaks my heart. Not gonna lie. But when Dylan was 3, and at this point, he's 3 years old, okay? He speaks clearly. He obviously speaks with a very American accent. And he understands us, right? He understands that we're having conversations and stuff. But we had just moved to New Jersey, and I was on the phone with him. And then now, so we also moved to New Jersey. So he's not even in a preschool or in school in St. Croix where he's with other Crucians and he have the opportunity. Because for me, a big part of why I made sure to speak standard American English in the house in St. Croix was because I'm like, he's going to already have access to our dialect with his friends, with his cousins. So he's going to be able to code switch, because my mom made it very clear that me and Diamond needed to learn how to code switch. So I was like, you know what? I'm not going to be as abrasive as she was, but that's how I'm going to make code switching a thing for him. He's going to be able to do both. Well, by the time we moved to New Jersey, I didn't factor in that he doesn't have access to our accents and dialects anymore. So, you know, he's in a preschool with a bunch of other kids, mostly white kids. All he hears is like a standard American English. And then my big sister uses AAVE more than anything, right? And so I'm on the phone with Diamond one day, hung in mele, okay? And you know, when I said we were pong in mele, y'all already know. Listen.
Great shit. Just
we were listen, it was Crucian, it was that raw Crucian accent. It was a dirty accent. And by the time I got off the phone, Dylan was playing with his little Power Rangers. And he goes, Mommy. And I said, yes, Papa. And he said, why were you speaking Spanish just now? I remember you telling me this story. And I could have cried. I literally because we were both preoccupied with what we were doing. Like, I think I was like tidying up my dresser, whatever I was doing.
Let me ask you something, Deidre.
Let me ask you something. I didn't know you could speak Spanish.
Last time I checked, you to talk English, but I thought it was not English.
That was not English. When I tell you, I was mortified. So whatever I was doing, and that's the thing, we weren't looking at each other. He's sitting on the floor playing with his little Power Rangers. I'm like tidying up the dresser or something. So none of us are looking at each other, but he asked me that, and I literally stopped and I just turned in his direction. And I said, what? I wasn't speaking Spanish.
But picturing Dylan being like, Deidre.
You know, that's how he treats me. Like,
I'm not even looking at you like, listen, bitch.
I need to understand when you became a bilingual ass hoe. Okay? So I was like, Dylan, Mommy wasn't speaking Spanish. He said it sounded like Spanish.
He said, bitch, is this a binational household or not?
I said, it wasn't Spanish, baby, but that's the way I speak. That's how we tend to speak in St. Croix. He knows he's never forgotten St. Croix, okay? So I said, that's usually how we speak in St. Croix, but I'm sorry you didn't understand me. And he was like, okay. So ever since then, I've been way more intense. Like, I only use my accent in the house.
Yeah.
I only use my dialect. So now Dylan can fully understand me. He does not speak our accent. Once in a blue moon, he'll throw out a word. And there was some word he said one day where it sounded like the way we would say it. And I was so proud. Like, I was in a corner, like about to cry. I said, oh my God, there's hope.
Yeah.
But, oh God, it was something that me and my niece were trying to teach him to say. He said it. And we were like, yes. But I recognize that Dylan is going to be one of those Black American kids who comes from a Caribbean like household,
but is not,
doesn't speak the way we do. And it kind of makes me sad, but at the same time, I'm like, at least he has access to his culture. At least he is a proud, one thing about Dylan is a proud Crucian, to the point where one time when he was like 5, he corrected me. We were in an Uber and we were like in a different town. The Uber driver asked us like where we're from or where we live, something like that. And I just said Jersey City because that's where, we were living. And he literally he said, we're not from Jersey City, we're from St. Croix. And I said, we're actually not from Jersey City, we're from St. Croix. He don't play, he's a Crucian. So yeah, you're right. Like if you're going possibly, because we know that's very much on the fence. It's not even on the fence. It's lucky if it makes it to the fence.
Shit, they're on the other side of the fence watching me just holding the fence like this.
Any possibility, if there's a chance that you might pop out a baby for that man, then yeah, you're gonna have to really make sure you're using that accent.
I think that's the reality of it for a lot of this generation of Caribbean kids, right? The reality of it is economically and environmentally, the Caribbean is not in the best place right now. So many of us are going to have kids who were born in the US, who their extent of being exposed to our culture and our dialect is summers with like grandparents, or like when we get those visits and stuff, or even if they are surrounded by Caribbean people, when kids learn their language from school. Kids learn how to, and I don't think people realize that it's less you and more where they are 8 hours a day.
It's true.
My nieces and nephews don't have VI accents, even though they are very much Virgin Islands people. They weren't born there, they weren't raised there, and I've accepted like, okay, they're just gonna talk like stateside people, and that's fine. Every now and then though, the crew gonna jump out on my niece and it
pop out a little bit, right? It's cute.
So funny. She I forget what she said the last time I see her, and I was like, you were talking AAVE just now, and then I'm like a Crucian word. It was so weird, but anyway.
It's fascinating, and it's funny because I know somebody from Miami. His parents are Jamaican. He was born and raised in Miami, and he speaks very like American, but he does have a bit of an accent.
Yeah,
and that's how I found out his parents were Jamaican, because we were on the phone one time, and I said, this is going to sound
and it's because like you're used to talking to your parents or whatever, so it'll just jump out.
So it kind of jumps out because it does influence them.
Somebody the other day actually told, they were like, you do have an accent, and I was like, I do. And in my head I was like, I code switch very well, bitch, what are you talking about? But they were like, if you really listen to the way you pronounce certain words, exactly, the accent will come out. It's not like full-blown like Crucian dialect, but like the way that you say certain things is with an accent. And they're like, I'm so surprised that people didn't clock that you were not from here before.
Yeah, exactly. And so he said, we were talking about something, and he said something, and I said, are you from the Caribbean? And he was like, well, I guess you could say that. And then he said, I was born and raised here, but my parents are Jamaican. And I was like, okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. So that's the thing. There is that influence there. And somebody, like I said, somebody with a good ear, somebody who's been exposed to a variety of different cultures and stuff.
Like I said, we're always listening for it. We always trying to find our people. Even if a person is speaking full-blown, quote unquote, proper English, no accent in sight, the way they say certain things, like even at that conference that I was at, I was sitting next to a woman and she was talking, it wasn't in the same session. Yeah. We were in a whole different session and she was talking to somebody else. And at one point I never to her and I was like, I'm detecting an accent. I was like, but I can't place it. And she ended up being from like Barbados or something. And I was like, I knew it. And I was like, I'm from the Virgin Islands. And we instantly obviously became best friends.
Of course, you're automatically best. You want to hear a funny story? I feel like I told this story on my TikTok. But the same Dominican girl who I worked with, we were at work one day. One of the travel agents was asking me out. She had done something that is a big no-no in the company. She told her clients that a particular room that they were interested in was confirmed with the property, but you're not supposed to do that until you get a confirmation number from the hotel. So she told the client, she pretty much guaranteed she could get this room for them. Turns out the hotel couldn't give her the room. So now she's calling my team, trying to get me to clean up her mess. So we're on the phone. I'm like, listen, I'm going to try to do my best. I'm going to see what I can do. You might have to pay more. You might have to, you might take a loss on it, but I'm going to see what I could do. So I get off the phone with her. I'm like, she got the nerve to be doing the most. And then I said, who sent she? And when I said, who sent she, my Dominican coworker literally stopped. And she said, Deidre, what did you just say? And I said, who sent she? And she said, bruh, she said her mom used to always ask them when they were kids, It's quien te manda.
Yeah, quien te manda. Listen.
She said her mom, and when I said who sent you, she literally said, Deidre, what did you say? And she said my mom would always say quien te manda, and that means who sent you in Spanish. And I was like, holy shit. And it was just so fascinating because she's like, I'm not even, because her thing was, she know, like, obviously, like, we're both from the Caribbean, like her parents were born and raised there, but she was raised, so she's a lot like Dylan in that she was born, well, Dylan was born home, but he's being raised here. So for her, it's very much like, okay, I'm being raised in America, but in a Caribbean household.
Yeah.
So she's like, yo, the fact that we Caribbean, regardless of the first language, she's like, the fact that you just said that shit, she said, I never heard that. Yeah, who sent you? So it was a really funny experience. It was one of those bonding moments for, and I actually adore her parents. Like, first of all, her parents are so fucking gorgeous. Like, but every time I would go to their house, they adored me. Her dad used to spoil me and make the best coffee. And her family is just so beautiful. Her grandma used to be chilling on the couch with the dogs. I'm like, oh, they're so gorgeous.
I love a Caribbean household moment. I really do. I mean, and in that, like, thinking about those connections that we make when we discover each other's accents, or like when we find out where we're from and all of that stuff, I think that's the part that is most frustrating about the need to code switch sometimes, because I don't wonder, like, how many rooms have I been in where I wasn't using my accent? Did I miss out on connecting with someone who looks like me? Like, how many times, and even with other, like, even with African-American people, right? How many rooms have I been in where I was doing my like work language code switch and another Black person was in the room? I was probably like, she ain't one of us. Like, I don't worry about that.
That's a thing. Yeah.
And then, like you said, the other part of it is I've accepted that if I have a child and they born in the US, to an extent, their culture is going to be lost. But what scares me is, like, even for Caribbean kids who are born in the US but raised in Caribbean households, they can trust that their mother is going to have an accent, that a father going to have an accent, that they're going to be around relatives who speak that way. And in my head, it's like, well, I married an American man. Their entire paternal side of the family, if I have kids, are African-American people who are going to speak AAVE, which is, again, I have no problem with that.
Yeah.
But they're probably going to be disconnected from my side of the family. So unless I speak to them in my dialect and in my accent, like, they're not going to have any exposure to Krujan culture unless I'm like really intentional about it.
Like, you're gonna have to really go hard.
I'm gonna have to like drag my fucking child every summer and be like, ma, here, like, take them and
this
like
baby,
make them jump off a big dock or something. Like, just make sure my child is a Krujan, please. Like,
it's gonna have to really be a thing where this, because like, luckily Dylan was born there and he was only 3 when we moved, but he never forgot St. Croix. And I've taken him to St. Croix every summer for like 3 years straight. Like, and even he told me, so last I told him for his 10th birthday we could, do whatever he wanted. So his options were a Disney cruise or a trip home. Actually, no, he decided that he wanted to go home. It wasn't even like an option. I just was like,
I would have picked home every time.
Yeah, and mind you, I didn't even make like, every time I asked him if I could take you anywhere in the world, where would you go? He would be like, St. Croix. And I'm like, someplace you haven't been.
What's funny? Steven has said that. I'd be like, babe, I'd be like, babe, we need to plan a trip. I'd be like, where do you want to go? And he'd be like, honestly, St. Croix. Like, he don't want to come home. Like,
Dylan wants to go home. So I thought that he would definitely like choose the Disney cruise. And he was like, no, I actually just want to go to St. Croix for my birthday. So I'm like, okay, fine. So
they're going to take me to other places that look like St. Croix anyway.
Yeah, so I said, fine. So what I did do, because his next birthday is a milestone. He's turning 10. So Diamond and I decided we're going to have like a very lavish, like very sickening. We're going to rent like one of those very rich, bougie vacation rentals on the water. And we're going to just make it a really big deal. So we could I'm like, because the kind of money I would have spent on a Disney cruise, I'm just going to invest that money back home. So I'm going to get a very expensive vacation rental. I want a Black owned one. So put me in touch with somebody who owns that type of property and it's Black owned.
I think I know people who have like properties back home. Let me double check.
I want something like at Estate Choice or something, but I need it to be owned by a Black person. Like, if I'm gonna spend that kind of money on a vacation rental, I want it to be with a Black person, like even if it's not like a native. I'll take a Black transplant who owns good property. Like, at this point, I just want a Black person to get these ducats because it's a lot of ducats. But anything for my baby who's a proud Krujan but don't understand our dialect.
So with that being said, what does the process look like of turning off the code switch? Like, so I guess let me ask my initial question.
Yeah.
For those of us who are code switching at work or in white spaces, like, is it necessary that we turn that off at some point, or is it okay that we are doing that for self-protection? This is in your opinion. Nobody could tell you what to do at the end of the fucking day.
So I think, one of the things that I lean into all the time is that two things can be true at once.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it is a form of self-protection and it is good. I think it is, even though it could seem beneficial to the people who are being spoken to, I do think that it's more beneficial to the person doing the code switching. Mm-hmm. Because for one, you don't know the type of people you're around. Mm-hmm. One of the struggles that I faced when I first stopped code switching at work, and I don't think it's fair. Yeah, when I stopped code switching, because remember, in my early days of code switching, I took on a more American accent, whereas now I use my Crucian accent. I just don't use the dialect, right? Mm-hmm. One of the struggles I faced, and I won't even call it a struggle because I was very assertive in that, is I would run into people who thought that it was okay to say Caribbean things. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Or they thought that the things that I would say, like, they just thought that they could do that. So one example was, you know how if you drop something, your parents will yell out, mash it up. Mm-hmm. So when I was working at Starbucks, I remember somebody dropped something and I jokingly yelled out, mash it up. And they were like, what? But the only person who knew what that was a girl on the team who was Haitian. Mm-hmm. And me and her had a good laugh about it. And then finally, because one thing about working at a place like Starbucks is naturally, if you're with a good team, if you're at a good store, you're going to have a good rapport. Mm-hmm. So we like explained it to everybody. Everybody was like, wow, that's so cool. So we're like, that's usually something our moms say when something breaks. But then what would happen is every time something would fall,
they would say, mash it up.
Mash it up. And I was thinking, and that's where the gatekeeping came in from you. But then what would happen is people who started to get close to me in the workplace, who I started to form like a work friendship with, they would then say things that are typically like said by Caribbean people, like Lada Mercy. Mm-hmm. And then
listen, once the Jamaican shit, the start, I'd just be like, you have lost me there.
So basically, when you first decide not to code switch, you're going to have to be prepared to be assertive in telling people, no, you cannot do that. Because I had to have those conversations. I had to pull people aside and say, hey, I know you don't mean any harm, but it's offensive for you to try to use a Caribbean accent when you're not from the Caribbean. It's offensive when you say
David Diggs, Sebastian the fucking crab.
Oh, let's talk about it. So it's going to come with that. So if you know that you don't want to be bothered with having to, because one of the things that being one of the only Black people in a space comes with is you have to be the educator. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So if you know in your heart you don't have the bandwidth or the interest in educating people, in teaching people the ways that they are being offensive, don't bother giving up on the code switching. Use the code switching, but be more intentional about leaving the code switching at work.
I think that's my biggest thing is the question I ask myself when it comes to like, do I want to code switch in this scenario or not, is what is the level of safety here for me? Right?
Yes.
So in the conversation on, because a lot of people from the Caribbean look down on Caribbean people who code switch. And my question to them is like, you can't guarantee my peace or my safety in this space that I'm code switching in. Like you can have your opinions, but at the end of the day, like what you choose to deal with versus what I want to deal with in my day-to-day activities is different. And for me, I know for a fact, as much as I may get along with different people at work, as much as I have the respect of different people at work, like you said, the minute they hear that accent, there's a form of like entertainment that comes into it for them. And I don't want to correct them. Form of entertainment.
Exactly. Because guess what? I'm not going to sit here. Like, for instance, one of my best friends, Daniela, she is Colombian. She moved to Miami when she was like 12, I think. So she still has a very thick Colombian accent. That doesn't mean that when she and I get together, I should be trying to speak with a Colombian accent. You know what I mean? That's her dialect. That's how she speaks, you know? Daniela's been teaching me Spanish.
Let me say one thing though. As much as I am talking about code switching and respecting people's accents and not mimicking dialects, I'm sorry. If you British, I'm mimicking that shit every single fucking time. I apologize. I am doing that. I'm obsessed
I love a good bit.
With a good British accent. And I'm sorry, y'all took over the whole world. You are literally colonialism. You know what? Y'all invented branded.
Colonialism. Yeah, we're going to do y'all's accent.
As soon as a British person enter in the room, I'm sorry. I am suddenly from South London. Okay.
You want to hear something wild?
It's on.
I'm gonna tell you something wild. Let me tell you something wild. Because listen, we do run into, because we know this is a thing in the Black community across the diaspora. Okay. We have to address this. There are certain Black people who, again, they try to be like a better Black, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
right?
token.
The token, there's a certain aspect of self-hatred that comes with being Black in some Black people, right? And so one time I was at this restaurant that I loved, this gorgeous Black-owned restaurant. The food is phenomenal. Anyway, our server was a Black dude with a British accent, but I could hear a Caribbean accent in the British accent. And I said, "Where are you from?" And he told me whatever part of Great Britain he was from. I said,
"Pio people am from big
dog."
I
said, "Where are you from? Like, you're from the Caribbean." He said, "No, I'm from," and he named the place in Britain.
Which, to an extent, we have to respect that, because if a person feel like they're from fucking Greenwich, they're from Greenwich.
Okay? Yeah. So I said, "Wow, that's so crazy, because you sound Guyanese to me." And that's when he finally was like, "Holy shit!" Like, because he said,
he probably thought you were asking him like, "No, are you from Africa?" Like,
yeah. I said, "Well, that's crazy."
Like, no, bitch.
Yeah. When I specifically said Guyanese, he was like, "Okay, this bitch she mean business." So he finally, and mind you, I was dating a Kenyan guy at the time. So maybe he really thought that I thought he was African. I don't know. And some Black people, the thought of being African scares them. So maybe you make a good point. Maybe he did think that I thought he was from Africa. So I said, "Wow, that's crazy, because you sound Guyanese to me." And he kind of took a step back. He said, "Well, I am Guyanese, but I think his parents moved him to somewhere in the UK when he was a baby, or when he was really little. So he didn't think he still had a Guyanese accent." And I'm like, "Well, I said, you do sound British. However, a Caribbean person with a good ear could hear your accent. Like, you definitely sound Guyanese." Like, so it was an interesting conversation, but he also didn't seem thrilled to be clocked as a Guyanese. Like, I could almost see the wheels in his head turning, where he's like, "Oh, hell no, bitch."
I've had that happen before with VI people, where I'm like, "I hear, are you from the Virgin Islands by any chance?" And they're like, "Yeah, I'm from St." Or they'll say, "I'm from St. Croix," and like they'll go back to talking, however, and
that's their way of telling you
that. Yeah. I'm like, okay, you don't want to be a Crujan in this
you
space,
don't want to,
in this moment. That's fine. I respect it. Use a Morascan, but otherwise, that's fine.
Yeah, so it's sad, like that level of like self-loathing, but it was so fascinating. I remember the night so vividly, and even when he left, my date was like, "Dude, like, how did you peep that? Like, he just sounded British to me."
And radar.
I'm like, listen, a Caribbean person gonna hear a Caribbean accent, like, and it was fascinating. But yeah,
anyway, I thinking about the fact that he was like, "I'm from such and such," in
he would not let it
go. Papa, if that's how you were born, but you sound like a Caribbean person.
Yeah, anyway. I said, "Wow, that's crazy, because you sound Guyanese to me."
He just said,
literally was the way he looked at me, like, "Bitch," like, because and that's the other thing, because a lot of the time, even if you clock a Caribbean accent, sometimes people choose the wrong region. So sometimes I've had instances where somebody knows, they could tell I'm from the Caribbean, but they assume I'm from Trinidad, or you know what I mean? And I have to say, "No, I'm from the Virgin Islands." So maybe he was expecting that. I don't think he expected me to clock the exact place he's from. I think he really thought that I would say Jamaican, and then he could be like, "No, I'm not Jamaican." But I'm like, "No, baby, you Guyanese."
and one day we gotta wrap up, because
yeah, because we going over.
We're on time limit. But one day we will talk about Caribbean people's relationship to Jamaican people specifically, and why there's a lot of resentment there. I don't feel bad sometimes that it almost sounds like we're trying to distance ourselves from Jamaican people, but we're not.
Far from the truth.
It's not the fault of Jamaican people. It's the fault of everybody else who have made Jamaica the default for the Caribbean identity, right? And we're gonna talk about that, because there's an episode specifically on Caribbean culture coming up this season. But we're gonna talk. I actually want to get a Jamaican person on the podcast for that.
Oh,
so
yes,
I need to go find me a yadi for this episode. But anyway,
that's why I used to call my friend who was Jamaican, who I was involved with. That was literally his name in my phone. His name was the yadi in my phone.
Listen, I need to go find one. But all this to say, I'm glad we had this conversation on code switching, because again, it's something I'm still exploring. I don't have all the answers yet. I don't know what that looks like for me going forward, but I wanted to make sure that we created a space for it, because I don't think I'm the only person who goes through that struggle. Like,
absolutely.
And we don't think about it because when we're in spaces with other Caribbean people or Black people, we're not code switching with each other. So sometimes we don't even know the way that the people we know and love code switch with other people. So I guess my question for the audience, using @GoodUpPod or #GoodUpTuesday is, tell me, like, do you code switch? If you do, where and in what instances you code switch? And like, how do you feel about it? Is it a problem for you? Is it something you feel insecure about? Or do you just not give a fuck and it's just the reality of what it is? Because that's also fair. But anyway, you can, so we ain't gonna have time to do Deidre's astrology
not today, but next week
in this
for
episode,
sure.
but next week for sure. And with that being said, you go keep the lights on in this bitch over on patreon.com/GoodUpPodcast. You get video episodes, full video episodes of all our stuff, and you get bonus content and a lot of good shit. And yeah, with that being said, we love you bad. See you next week in this Scunt, and tip your waiters as long as they don't,
as long as they're proud of being Guyanese.
Yeah, as long as they're proud of being Guyanese. And with that said, Deidre, tell the people bye. This season of the Good Up Podcast is sponsored by Empath Psychological Services. The Good Up Podcast is Black woman hosted and produced by Deidre Ritter and Heiza Quinones Ivory. Find us on all social media platforms @GoodUpPod. Tag us using the hashtag GoodUpTuesday and join the VIP section over on Patreon for exclusive bonus content at patreon.com/GoodUpPodcast.